Every evening when the rest of the world is asleep, Beetle is making his way across Hyrule where they undoubtedly see once great buildings left in ruins. When Cece is sneaking out to enjoy some carrots, she can see the beautifully constructed homes and shops of Hateno. After releasing my first take on Chronology, I was left with questions, and one of those questions was understanding how old the Hylian civilization is by the point of the era of the wilds. If you've seen that video, you know that there is evidence to support the idea that the Zelda team built the world in a very intentional way, by aligning structures according to magnetic north based on the time of their construction. If you've not seen that video, I've left a link in the top right corner of the screen. Rather than disrupt your experience of watching this, I'm going to provide a small refresher about it in a bit, so don't worry if you haven't seen it. If I had to sum up that research as simply as possible, I'd say this. The older the structure, the more it seems to be rotated on the map in a clockwise direction. This time around, I'm going to dive deep into the way that construction technology and techniques have evolved while providing evidence for when they were built. You're going to see throughout this examination that the dots between the games do actually connect. So let's turn back time and go back to the start. To catch you up on how the theory of chronology works, essentially, the path of the sun in the era of the wilds traverses over Hyrule from northeast to southwest. You can observe this for yourself if you go hang out at the ancient tech lab in Akala prior to sunrise, or the lightning temple at sunset. Before I'd ever noticed that, I made the observations about the rotations of major buildings, and it started a rabbit hole of research around the way that real-world ancient cultures would build things aligned with or perpendicular to magnetic north. This led me to discovering points of data that I was able to use to roughly project the age of structures in Hyrule based on their rotation. This, of course, doesn't apply to contemporary structures like houses and villages, because even in the real world, they are typically fit to the available terrain or functional needs. To really demonstrate how to calculate the age of something using this method, we're going to do a calculation together. Let's take Hyrule Castle as an example. The first step is to find magnetic north in the present. Since we know the sunrise and sunset locations, we can determine it pretty easily. Next, we need to get the rotation of the thing we wish to measure, but how do we determine that? My approach is based in the way that ancient cultures in the real world would align buildings. To apply that, I draw a line through the location from the entry. In the case of Hyrule Castle, this is pointed to true north. To get the amount of change, we simply take magnetic north and measure the angle from the thing we're trying to determine the age of. In the case of Hyrule Castle, it's 30 degrees. Now that we have that number, we simply multiply it by 366. I'm not going to go fully in depth on that number because it was effectively the purpose of the first video. Suffice it to say, it's the number of years that pass for every degree of change to magnetic north. As we go on, I'm going to supply more evidence to prove that this calculation is accurate. For now, though, I think we've done enough math. Before we dig into construction styles throughout history, I have a super important message from my friend Evan, aka Decopunk 1927.
Hi, ladies non-binaries and gentlemen, Evan here. I was the one who taught Zoe the word archaeomagnetism, and I learned it from this book, Sightseeking. The magnetic declination, printed near the north arrow on topographic maps, indicates the number of degrees magnetic north deviates from true north in a given place and year. Currently, the magnetic declination in the Boston area is 16 degrees west, meaning the compass needle points that many degrees west of true north. This declination varies slightly each year, increasing and then decreasing in centuries-long cycles. No full cycle has yet been recorded for Boston, although extrapolation from scant colonial data suggests the one begun in the early 1600s is due to complete itself. One source prematurely declared this reversal was already apparent in 1962. Magnetic declination decreased from about 16 degrees west in 1600 to about 6 degrees west in 1780, and has slowly and reciprocally increased ever since. In theory, a north-south boundary line surveyed by the needle in the mid-17th century would deviate about 14 degrees west of north, while one surveyed in the mid-18th century would bear only 7 degrees west of north. Thus, had colonial New Englanders evinced a scrupulous regard for compass north, the secular swing of the needle would have impressed on the landscape a sort of archaeomagnetic grain for dating the cadastre. A classic archaeomagnetic anecdote, so neat as to arouse skepticism, concerns the Josiah Coffin House on Nantucket. Like most early salt boxes, it was south-fronted, and by measuring the exact bearings of the flanks of the house, Professor Henry Mitchell determined they were aligned on a magnetic north-south line in 1723. Knocking on the door, the owner informed him that the house had been finished a year later, in 1724. What Zoe is doing in Hyrule is a real thing that real scientists do. So let's go sight-seeking.
In the era of the sky, the surface is largely covered in post and lintel construction. This holds true even in the vibrant, expressive ancient temples. If you're wondering what post and lintel construction is, it's a construction method that goes back to many of the oldest structures in the world. The general idea is that you have strong horizontal elements, like stone beams, that are held up by solid vertical columns or pillars. One of the most fascinating observations about the ancient temples in Skyward Sword is that they demonstrate a key advancement on the style. Post and lintel construction has several limitations that make it ineffective for large open interior spaces. Holding up all that weight requires frequent placement of posts to account for the immense weight of horizontal elements. In the real world, that changed with a crucial piece of Roman engineering work, the arch. Arches enabled the development of very large structures in the real world. Coming back to the ancient temples, we can observe the use of arches in the larger rooms at a higher rate than in smaller areas. This gives us an indicator that the development team for Skyward Sword were attempting to use real-world architectural principles in the design of larger buildings. I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty cool that they put that much intention into the design. Let's keep going and fast forward to the era of the hero of time. By this point in history, we can observe that the use of post and lintel construction was much more limited, and that many large buildings utilize what's known as arch and vault construction. It's not the only style either. The use of cast stone bricks is more prominent along with rubble masonry. Arch and vault construction takes the advancement of the Roman arch and expands on it to create a series of interconnected arches that allow for vaulted ceilings, while transferring the weight of a structure downward to provide stability. Walls between arches are often filled in with cast stone brick, which provide additional load balancing and, in some cases, decorative purposes. Rubble masonry also appears throughout the landscape as well. Its name is exactly what it sounds like. Rubble masonry makes heavy utilization of cast stone brick fragments, mud, and primitive concrete. We can see the transition of styles if we take a look at the fairy fountains. We see the older post and lintel methodology, and in some cases, the style appears to be perfected. A quick look at the horizontal elements in the fountains yields that there are details that show just how closely the development team were trying to express real-world principles. It doesn't stop there. If we take a look at Twilight Princess, we can see a continuation of the arch and vault system. Castletown shows a progression of the skill of Hylian builders in understanding the style. They've managed to achieve creating decorative and functional spaces. The sewers beneath Castletown also demonstrate the extension of this mastery. Kakariko Village, on the other hand, shows that rubble masonry was becoming more popular for residential areas. Once again, the intentionality of area design across Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess shines through. But it doesn't stop there. Hyrule Field beneath the Great Sea shows us post and lintel ruins and a distinct lack of progress of the arch and vault system. Historically, this makes sense. The kingdom of the adult timeline suffered greatly prior to the flood, and the environmental art shows us the outcome of that turbulent period of time. Now that we have a view of the evolution of construction styles, let's take a look at the Era of the Wilds map. I've taken the time to catalog most of the ruins, and I've also color-coded them by construction style. Bringing back our age calculation, we can make correlations between the age and usage of a construction material and the rotation. But how do we know the age calculations are right? Thankfully, proof comes in the form of logical deduction by reading history in-game and from masterworks. If you've seen my work around the flooding of the Central Plain, you know that we have a rough timing for when that happened. If you're not familiar, Masterworks gives us a clue that the flooding happened shortly after the Seal War. With the current calculations, cast stone brick as well as arch and vault construction start showing up about 10,000 years before founding. And its proliferation can be observed all the way through founding and beyond. It stands to reason that we should be able to observe some proof of the flooding impacting the buildings made in the cast stone brick style. And indeed, we have that proof. The Zora history tells us that every decade or so, heavy rainfall occurs, and that it's slowly eating away at the mountain. Hi, it's me just making a quick note. For those of you that enjoyed the other Great Flood, I wanted to note that while I knew that details of heavy rainfall were an issue, I didn't know that it was eating away at the mountain. My good friend Lorulian historian provided me with translations of the Zora history that capture those details. I'm elated because it proves that heavy rain was eating the mountain, likely through the acidification processes I'd mentioned in that video. I plan to come back and address it in a follow-up. Thank you for attending my Zed Talk. So now we know that the domain itself subsided and flooded the central plain. And it flooded something that we can prove existed prior to the flood itself. Clearly, Sokola Falls didn't always pour into torrent wetlands. How do we know this? A quick view of the surface beneath the falls shows that there was nowhere for the water to go. This tells us that the ruins here must have existed prior to the subsidence of the mountain. This alone demonstrates that the construction style was utilized prior to the flood, and it gives us limited proof that our age calculations are decently close. One of the things that was a loose end during my initial review of chronology was about why the kingdom adopted true north-based construction at the time of founding. The same passage that talks about the flood provides us with some of the reasoning. One of the key reasons that we adopted true north cartography in the real world has to do with logistics and navigation. Masterworks provides clarity and hints about this. When it talks about the construction of the castle, it speculates that reclaiming the central plain would have been crucial for creating a way to build supply lines for the construction of the castle. With that, we start to see the dawn of a real era of prosperity for Hyrule. The proof doesn't stop there. Something rather peculiar happens when you align these calculations against the analysis of chronology in the downfall and adult timelines. Downfall provides us with the most complete set of chronological clues. The most important thing is that it provides us with a sense of the passage of time in terms of generations and even concrete years in some cases. To explain that exhaustive body of research, my friend Lore aka Lorulian historian has agreed to let me share his findings. This timeline begins not with triumph, but with failure. Link, the hero of time, is defeated in his battle against Ganondorf. It's a possibility only briefly acknowledged in the split of Ocarina of Time's legacy, but its implications ripple across centuries of ruin and resilience. In the wake of the hero's fall, the Seven Sages managed to seal Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm. This event was the Imprisoning War, a cataclysmic conflict between the forces of light and darkness. This happened, Sonoshi, as the elders would say, a long time ago. Sonoshi is a phrase passed down by the likes of Sahasrahla in A Link to the Past, suggesting a time buried deep in memory. In the English version, this war is said to have occurred 3 or 4 generations ago, calculating based on patrilineal generational gaps, about 30 to 34 years each. This places the Imprisoning War at roughly 100 to 136 years before A Link to the Past. I want to pause and clarify something here. Through the backstory of A Link to the Past, we have deduced that it's been about 100 years since Ocarina of Time happened. I want to explain how I got here when the game mentions the Imprisoning War in its backstory. Ocarina of Time was originally incepted to tell the events of the Imprisoning War. That changed late in its development, and we now know that the Imprisoning War happened much earlier than Ocarina of Time. Irrespective of that knowledge, Ocarina of Time still precedes A Link to the Past. It's for that reason that I'm choosing to keep the estimate of 100 to 136 years, just after Ocarina of Time. To further back up that thinking, we can see that catalyst events in each branch of the timeline all happened around 100 years after Ocarina of Time. That out of the way, let's keep going. In A Link to the Past, Ganon has broken free of the Sacred Realm, twisting it into the corrupted Dark World. Link is once again summoned to stop him. Though victorious, the scars of war and legend linger. Fast forward a few generations, Sahasrahla's descendants still remember the war, but not firsthand, and we arrive at A Link Between Worlds. The game subtly updates Sahasrahla's lineage, referring to several generations since the sealing. By some accounts, this is 7 generations, which suggests a further passage of 217 to 238 years. Meanwhile, Oracle of Ages introduces us to Queen Ambi and her descendant Ralph, separated by 8 generations. She affectionately calls him her grandchild's 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 grandchild, and the math checks out. That's between 204 to 272 years. The game's time travel mechanics confirm this, with the Maku tree remarking that she's waited hundreds of years for Link. So even if the story unfolds soon after A Link to the Past, the time jump between the past and present in Oracle of Ages adds another 2 centuries of distance to the timeline. The world changes slowly, but it changes. If we compare the maps of Oracle of Ages Labrina to the later Zelda 2, we notice something remarkable. The coastline has shifted. An expanded shoreline between the Graveyard and Crescent Island suggests sediment buildup and erosion over time. If this process mirrors natural sedimentation rates, we might infer that Zelda 2 takes place nearly 400 years after the present era of Oracle of Ages. So what does that mean for the downfall timeline as a whole? Ocarina of Time, Link falls, Ganon rises. Imprisoning war, approximately 100 to 130 years before A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past, the Dark World emerges, Ganon is defeated again. A Link Between Worlds, roughly 200 plus years after A Link to the Past. Oracle of Ages and Seasons, takes place soon after but contains a 200 plus year gap between past and present. Zelda 2, possibly 400 plus years later, shaped by time, memory, and geography. In total, we're looking at nearly a millennium of history from the fall of the Hero of Time to the final stand of the downfall timeline. 1,000 years of echoes where the phrase Sonoshi is not poetic exaggeration but a bitter truth. Because when heroes fall, history remembers. Not in vivid detail, but in fragments carved into murals, whispered by elders, and etched into the shape of the very land they were meant to protect. Before I get into the complete summarized findings of all the calculations and my interpretations of their meaning, I want to remark about the flip side of the observations about the chronology of those 2 timelines. If this theory is correct, it would mean that the time since the Seal War to the Ancient Calamity was nearly 1,000 years on the dot. That's quite the coincidence, along with all the other findings. It doesn't stop there either. One of the few ruins from after castle construction provides even more alignment with known events. The ruins of Samasa Plain show us something fascinating when we attempt to calculate an age for them. They should be around 10,614 years old, which is very close in history to the projected age when the Minish Cap and Ocarina of Time occurred. The importance of the name Samasa is a direct callback to the Oracle of Seasons, specifically to the Samasa Desert. If you're familiar with the Minish Cap, we know that Labrina and Holodrum existed at that point in history, because the oracles make mention of traveling from those distant lands. The more that I've tried to disprove this theory, the more I've found supporting evidence for its validity. Before I rest my case, I want to share my findings for how old I believe the ruins across Hyrule are. I shared preliminary ages previously, but I've made adjustments since then, and observations based on that. Additionally, since there is enough information available to calculate most ruins, it also means that for ruins built in a certain style, we can also extrapolate their age whenever it's not possible to determine their alignment to magnetic north. With that in mind, I'm going to distinguish things that are calculated with an equal sign, and things that are extrapolated with a tilde. This is so I can be clear and not accidentally mislead anyone. All of that pretext out of the way, I think I've done an awful lot of explaining so far, and for this next part, I'm gonna let music and information be your guide. I hope you enjoy it. Throughout that review, you may have found yourself wondering, how could you know how far back specific eras occurred? And I have an answer for that. Some eras, such as the Sky Era and the Era of Chaos, are extrapolated from construction material ages that are applied to games or through logical deduction. Take Skyward Sword, for example. If we know the majority of the architecture in Skyward Sword is post and lintel construction with limited use of arches, we can deduce that the P99 age for that construction style is most likely close. For the Era of Chaos, that's extrapolated based on the age of the original Temple of Time that sat on what we know today as the Great Plateau. If you follow the lore of the series, it's said that Rauru constructed the Temple of Time over top of the sealed temple ruins. To add to that, we also have information from Masterworks that tells us that the goddess statues are the oldest artifacts in Hyrule, and that they've remained unmoved since ancient times. Putting those two details together, I would deduce that the Era of Chaos, which concluded with the construction of the Temple of Light and the Temple of Time, happened around the construction time of that temple. I recognize that many believe the sealed temple is located inside the Forgotten Temple, but the location simply doesn't make sense to me. I won't tangent on this too much, but we can easily fact-check against available data. The goddess statue faces to the north at the end of the game. Due north of the sealed temple is Elden Volcano. What's more, the map of historical landmarks shows the Great Tree from Skyward Sword being southeast of Lake Hylia. That's pretty cut and dry. What about the span of time from the Era of Prosperity to the Era of the Hero of Time, though? That calculation comes from the dynamic duo, Twin Rova. In Ocarina of Time, it's stated that she is 400 years old. With respect to the fact that we don't know their ages in the memories in Tears of the Kingdom, I wager they are anywhere from 20 to 50 years old. Since we know that the kingdom was established by the point of the Minish Cap, but occurred before Ocarina of Time, we can deduce it happened somewhere in that 300 to 400 year span. I place the Force Era more or less in the middle to be on the safe side. Last but not least, the deductions for the Era of the Great Sea, the Twilight Era, and the Era of Light and Dark come from information provided in those games along with developer interviews. The flood that started the era without a hero happened around 100 years after the end of Ocarina of Time. Eiji Aonuma has stated that Twilight Princess happened around 130 years after Ocarina of Time. Finally, in-universe information provided by characters throughout the Downfall timeline helps to place it around 100 years later. There's also a multitude of things that follow the data I've collected throughout the research of this theory. If we look at the map of ruins from earlier, we can see that according to the data, the oldest ruins exist on the east and west sides of Hyrule. From that, we can deduce that Zonai solid block, along with post and lintel construction, likely preceded the recession of the Great Sea. This aligns with Skipper's map, which shows the two landmasses separated by a considerable body of water. On the flip side of that, we can also observe that the more recent ruins have a P99 construction age that places them near the time of the construction of the castle. This again matches the information provided by Masterworks, namely the part about how various facilities were built after the central plain was reclaimed. I could go on and on because there are findings on findings, and I plan to continue covering observations from the data I've collected in future videos and Lightcast episodes. I had a lot of fun researching this, and I couldn't have done it without input and feedback from several people. So to close, I want to say thank you to the collective Dream Shrine community. I'm blessed with thoughtful comments, and you all constantly provide me with thought-provoking insights. If you found yourself magnetized by this research, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, my friends.